Good morning and welcome to Rocky Mountain Poison and Drug Safety's 19th Annual Scientific Meeting. We are thrilled to have you join us virtually from all around the world. My name is Kate Reynolds. I am the Director of Research with RMPDS, and I will be your host for the day. Over the next few hours, you will have the opportunity to attend insightful presentations, engage in thought-provoking discussions, and discuss with experts in our field by submitting your questions in the Q&A feature. Our agenda is packed with a diverse range of topics leading up to our final panel discussion this afternoon. Before we begin, here are a few housekeeping items to ensure an enjoyable experience for everyone. Take time to get acquainted with the Zoom. You can find the agenda at the link provided in the chat feature. Should you encounter any technical issues, our support team is on standby to assist you. Click the Help button at the top of the screen for immediate assistance. We encourage you to actively participate in sessions. Use the Q&A function to ask questions or share insights. Your questions or comments may be featured during our Q&A portion. Now, without further ado, let's kick off today's event. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker and opening session from Dr. Richard Dart. Dr. Dart is the Director of the Rocky Mountain Poison and Drug Safety, a Denver Health and Hospital Authority division. Dr. Dart is also President of Canadian Consumer Product and Pharmaceutical Safety. He is also a Professor of Emergency Medicine and Medical Toxicology and Pharmacology. Thank you again for attending today. Let's welcome Dr. Dart to the stage for our opening session, leading the new frontier of psychoactive drug monitoring.
Good morning, everyone. This is Rick Dart, and thank you for the introduction, Kate. Well, this is almost a bit of deja vu, our 19th annual meeting. I suspect that some of you have attended all of those meetings. I can think of a couple at least. So if you have, pat yourself on the back. And for the rest of you, welcome to a meeting that will be divided into two parts, really. The first part this morning will be on opioids and some other medications. This afternoon will be mostly on the psychedelics. The two are highly interrelated, more than one would think, so hopefully you'll stay for the whole meeting. But this year in particular, I think we're going to have some very provocative and debatable information to present. So as Kate mentioned, please be ready to submit questions because I think this may generate many. Let me start by, as I do each year, noting that we have a huge a wonderful number of registrants. Thank you. We really pride ourselves on having a diverse audience, and I see that we've accomplished that again, and thanks to Jess Krasinski, who is the secret sauce behind this entire meeting. This is our updated figure on the number of publications and the number of citations that Radar Systems publications have had through 2024. You can see we continue our publication record. It's really one of the most valuable parts of what we do, rewarding to us, and so we really are happy to see this. This is through 2024. I should point out that we're off to a great start in 2025 as well. These papers have been already published in 2025, ranging from things like psychedelic trips, which you'll hear more about during this meeting, people who are traveling within the United States, in order to obtain and use psychedelic medications. Some new information on opioids that I'm going to present as well. Some polysubstance work, which is so important both to the opioids and to psychedelics, as you'll see in these presentations, I think. So I won't dwell on that any longer, except to say that this is an incredibly dynamic time for both opioids and psychedelics and stimulants, and really every drug that someone wants to misuse or abuse. This is my annual slide to remind me and everyone else, I think, that, in our society, it's very interesting. The celebrities seem to be the bleeding edge of our society, and they have unlimited access and resources to do whatever they want, and they do. And so they're often sort of the bird in the canary cage, the canary in the bird cage, excuse me. Last year I didn't even put Matthew Perry's picture up here because I was afraid it would be too close for people, too real. But I felt after now we can put him on here. But you can see incredible people who were wonderful entertainers, but succumb to such common issues that we're going to deal with today, and that really affect not just hundreds of thousands, but millions of people each year. Speaking of which, let's talk about overdose deaths. You've seen this figure repeatedly, and the points I want to make here are that it's great that we see the synthetic opioids plateauing and on other figures maybe decreasing a little bit. That's great. Now we have increases in cocaine and the psychostimulants. I'll come back to that. The blue line, which you can't see very well there, are the prescription opioids, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. And if you drill down on that and have this figure that shows just the prescription opioids from 1999 to 2023, you can see the number of deaths peaked back in about 2016, 2017, and has declined some through 2023. This is great news. You might think, well, why didn't it go down more? And I think one reason is that you can see there, if you look at the blue and the teal lines, you can see that a large number of these actually have a synthetic opioid involved as well. So while these were polydrug exposures, polydrug deaths, and the additive effects of fentanyl and the other opioid caused the death. In many of these cases, that opioid was something like tramadol, codeine, or even hydrocodone that's unlikely to kill them. And so a lot of those are probably simply fentanyl deaths. So I think we can pretty safely say that US overdose deaths involving prescription opioids have decreased even more than shown here. But they're still too high. I mean, this is still far higher, far, far higher than we were in the 1990s. And so we should definitely not claim success. Not to mention that death is just one outcome, and there are many other very unfortunate outcomes of opioid use besides dying. Now, as we would expect, and as people have worked hard to achieve, the number of opioid prescriptions has decreased dramatically and continues to decrease. This is great news. So we have all these positive indicators, and you even see some statements in the news and in the press talking about how we're getting over the opioid crisis. I hope that's true, but I'm not sure it's true, because what we're seeing in so this raises the issue. I wanted to raise this because I'm going to come back to that, is something we don't understand. We still don't understand. So RADARS has been going for almost 20 years now. We still don't understand this relationship. And really, there hasn't been any funding to try to really get at how do the licit and illicit prescription medications, especially opioids, interact? How do they affect each other in the course of an illness, in the course of addiction that patients experience? People focus on certain parts of the pathway, but it really doesn't cover the whole thing. And there's so many unanswered questions, which are becoming more important because of the data, I think, because of the data that I'm about to present. Those data will be coming from our system, the non-medical use of prescription drugs, which is an online survey administered twice yearly to a total of 60,000 respondents, so a fairly large survey. It collects data about lifetime and recent non-medical use, misuse, and abuse of both prescription and illicit medications. Now, our definition that is used in this for non-medical use is in a way not directed by your healthcare provider, even just once or just a little. And I'm emphasizing that because it's a pretty broad, we realize that's a pretty broad definition, and that was intentional. So for you statisticians, right, this increases our sensitivity, but decreases our specificity in terms of when a person answers whether they actually are non-medical users. We preferred to have a lower threshold to understand that, and that'll become very important later in this presentation. We also collect sources, reasons, routes, patterns of use. It's a really remarkable tool that we have now been using for 6 years, for 6 years. And we also have compared it repeatedly with other survey instruments. We've done validation work on this, so it's become a trusted and reliable tool. So NMURX will tell us that, like the prescription numbers you saw, people endorse opioid use similarly. In other words, it's decreasing. So from 2018 through 2023, we have seen a decrease in people who say, I used an opioid in the past month. Great, just what we expected. The catch is that when I look at the next slide, this shows us the number of people who said, I used an opioid non-medically. Now, like I said, it's a pretty low bar to get over for them. But on the left, we have the number of adults. On the vertical axis, we have the number of adults who, because only adults take this survey, we have the number of adults who endorse that response across, and then time on the bottom. So we went from, in 2019, from about 11 million people. These are nationally extrapolated numbers from our sample. I think Dr. Black and others will be talking about similar issues in this afternoon. But we went from an estimated 11 plus million people who declared themselves non-medical users to 18 by the first quarter of 2025. So a pretty big increase, 50% increase basically. You can see at the bottom there that there's also a slight increase in fentanyl and heroin. And when you remove the prescription opioids to get rid of the range compression caused by those high numbers, you see that these have actually increased some too. More, not heroin as much. I'm not sure those would be statistically different, the red line, but the illicit fentanyl clearly has gone up from roughly 1 to 2 million people in the US who will say, I used illicit fentanyl last year, or last month. Which drugs account for those changes? So this is a little bit busy. If you've been with us in previous years, you've seen these repeatedly, and I'll go through this. Again, on the left axis, we have the number of adults, and then the trends for each drug. We like to show the variation by showing the actual values rather than smoothing the curves for you, which makes beautiful plots, but hides some of the information, I think. So here we have hydrocodone is the highest, but really it's increased a little, if any. However, if you look at tramadol, morphine, and fentanyl and buprenorphine, which I also cover on the next slide, these have all increased in a pretty substantial manner. The gray line is tramadol, and you can see that's basically doubled over this period. There's ups and downs, but in the end, it ends up roughly twice where it was. Morphine, somewhat similar, not quite as much of an increase, and the prescription fentanyl has gone up as well. We'll come back to fentanyl. It's an interesting case for sure. And getting to that, this now does the same thing. I've removed the really high volume drugs to focus on the lower volume drugs so you can see their changes more clearly. The green line is prescription fentanyl. We have hydromorphone and oxymorphone, which haven't changed much. Methadone has increased some, and buprenorphine clearly has decreased, almost doubled. So we see not every drug going up, but a substantial proportion of the prescription opioids have increased over the past 5 or 6 years. Some to a large degree, others to a lesser degree, but all of those seem inconsistent with the observation that we have decreasing prescriptions and decreasing use of the prescription opioids in general. Overall, I think I've had my figure wrong all these years. I need to reverse the size of those circles, because if you look at the number of people who are endorsing, saying I used non-medically, then the illicit drugs are actually much bigger than the illicit. In a sense, maybe that's not even surprising. I just had it wrong all these years, but it's an important realization, at least it was for me. What we still don't understand is how the illicit really feeds the illicit, or vice versa. It's undoubtedly both ways, I would venture to say, but actually it's hard to prove even simple statements like that with reliable data. So we have roughly, if you added those together, there'd be 3 or 4 million people who used illicitly, and about 18 million who said, I non-medically used a prescription drug. So you may be wondering, why would methadone and buprenorphine increase? Some of you, I think, intuitively have leaped to the same place that I have, which is, well, I know that over the past, I don't know, well, more than 10 years, 15 years, easy, we've been trying to increase the use of methadone and buprenorphine. And that's a good thing, right? Those are used in the treatment of opioid use disorder and are really important aspects of care. This figure is just to show the increase in methadone dispensed by opioid treatment programs over 2016 to 2023. And it's just an example to document that we know this is happening. We wanted it to happen. There was legislation to help buprenorphine become more widely used. Medicaid covers it, et cetera. And so this is generally a good thing, we think. But actually, again, we don't have real data to say that the increase in methadone or buprenorphine non-medical use is beneficial. And that's more worrisome for methadone, of course, because methadone has a very long half-life, and I, in my career, have witnessed well-meaning clinicians have a patient die who is using their drug as prescribed because the clinician ramped up the dose too fast. We actually published a paper on this once. And it's a tragic episode because both parties are just trying to do what's right, but methadone is a tricky drug to use. And so to have more of that in the community where other people can use it could lead to bad outcomes, and I'm not sure we're looking for them. Now, a harder question is, why would prescription fentanyl increase? Prescriptions for fentanyl have decreased, clearly. It raises a couple issues. One is the second bullet there, which is what I call preferential availability to non-medical users, meaning as a clinician, patients come and they have pain or they claim to have pain and they want an opioid. I don't think it's that surprising to think that a person who is trying to use the healthcare system to, shall we say, provide them drug they don't need is going to be a more facile and compelling patient than the patient who just wants their pain treated. If their doctor says no to them, they're just going to go away. Whereas if a person is trying to get drug inappropriately through their provider, they'll try multiple providers, or they'll keep trying the same provider, or they'll say, well, if you don't want to give me oxycodone, they'll just give me some, hydrocodone, that's fine. So I think that there is this phenomenon of people that fentanyl may be prescriptions, even though they're decreasing, may have a disproportionate increase in the number of those users who are actually non-medical users or abusers. But there's another issue, of course, and that is misidentification of counterfeit fentanyl. This gets really thorny and is almost a talk by itself because we know that fentanyl in the illicit market has now been branded, essentially. They come in different colors, they come in pills, they come in different colors. One could see a person saying, well, that must be a prescription drug of some type that I'm buying. So misidentification is undoubtedly present, and it's probably a meaningful amount of misidentification. The catch here is, why would that misidentification change over the past 6 years and change in such a progressive manner? We've known about counterfeit fentanyl for at least, even in the federal mortality data for 10, 11 years. It's been in the press a lot. So this is a very hard thing to quantitate. I'd love to do some more research on it, but right now the answer is we know it exists, I would say, but we don't know the magnitude of it. And then there's even another twist to that, which is, well, if I'm measuring people who say I took a prescription fentanyl product, even though it may not have been a true prescription, but just a pill that they bought that contained fentanyl, we still now are counting a person who thinks they are buying fentanyl and intended to buy fentanyl. So I think that's actually an important number, is to understand, well, why are more people saying they bought fentanyl? And the answer is right now, we don't know, because we can go back to them, but right now we don't go back to them to find out more information about why they are using, how, et cetera. I'll just go on. So one way to start to analyze this is to say, well, let's correct for the number of prescriptions that were dispensed and look at these drugs and say, once I correct, meaning some increase in misuse would be expected, right? Or non-medical use, I should say, when you have increased prescriptions, because more drug, more non-medical use. Very simple. The problem, of course, is that in general, prescriptions were decreasing, not for every single drug. So we adjusted for that by saying we're going to divide and get the rate per 10,000 prescriptions dispensed. And that's fascinating. You can see that the prescription fentanyl goes way up. The reason for that, I think, is that partly misidentification and partly that what prescription fentanyl there is out there is disproportionately prescribed to people who are non-medical users, hopefully without the provider knowing it. The blue line is methadone, which has doubled, and so that's gone up more. Methadone's a little complicated to interpret, but I think basically we need to say that's going up. That I think is real. Methadone prescriptions are hard to count because a regular prescription can go through an outpatient pharmacy, but a lot of methadone is dispensed by programs and does not count as a prescription. The other drugs are a little less dramatic. Several are increasing, at least some. And so it paints this picture that's a little concerning, which is even though prescriptions are decreasing, the abuse per prescription dispensed is actually increasing. In this slide, we simply grouped all of the extended release formulations, and it was quite interesting, as you can see here, that if you group the extended release, extended release formulations, you see the black line goes up threefold, basically. Immediate release on the bottom goes up some, it roughly doubles, so it's not innocent, but it's much smaller. But clearly, the use of an extended release opioid has a higher rate of non-medical use. Not that surprising. We know non-medical users and abusers like to pursue the extended release formulations because they contain a lot more opioid than an immediate release formulation. However, now I'm switching to the definition of abuse in the title there, and I put the definition at the bottom. So abuse is someone who endorses for enjoyment or to get high or to come down from a high from another drug. So pretty concerning. And if you look at these, like if you look at abuse and non-medical use in the sense of their DAS score, which is the drug abuse severity test, those of you who are familiar with that, people who endorse abuse clearly have higher DAS scores than people who endorse non-medical use. It's part of a spectrum, which I'll come to here in a second. So when we look at abuse, this is a higher bar. This is more worrisome. We see, again, prescription fentanyl very high. So that's concerning. Why is that going up when mortality is going down for the synthetic opioids? Methadone has gone up. We've talked about why. And the other drugs really haven't, and for somehow I left, buprenorphine is actually pretty flat. Methadone's gone up, but buprenorphine is pretty flat, meaning that as buprenorphine prescriptions have increased, the abuse of that drug has basically stayed the same, meaning the same proportion of people of these new prescriptions abuse the drug as people before who weren't getting that prescription. So reassuring in a sense, meaning it's a flat line. And you can see there are more flat lines here than there are for non-medical use. So we see this increase in NMURX in non-medical use, but not as much in abuse. Interestingly, that same observation about extended release formulations persists, though, when we look at the abuse, which again is intuitive because abusers want extended release formulations. They want more drug because they need more drug. They may be, develop some tolerance to it, most likely, and so they need a bigger dose, and they want to use it more frequently, so they need more of the drug. I do want to point out, though, that immediate release formulations are still increasing some. So no doubt many of you are saying, well, aren't these results in conflict with other measures? And the one that people always talk about, of course, is the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, which is appropriate. It's a great tool. We use it all the time. What's important to realize is that what NISTA studies is misuse. I put their definition of misuse there at the bottom of the slide. It's similar to non-medical use, but a higher bar. In other words, a person would be less likely to say yes to this. especially because they have a screener battery that the person has to endorse before they can get into the misuse questions. That's not meant as a criticism. They're trying to be more specific than sensitive. We're trying to be more sensitive. And both views are useful. So how do we then interpret the NMERX results compared to things like the National Survey of Drug Use and Health? Well, it's important to remember the progression of opioid use disorder and death. Here I've just lined them up to make them easy to see. We go from use to non-medical use to misuse to abuse to opioid use disorder, and hopefully not, but ultimately sometimes to death. The red bracketed, the red outlined steps are the FDA designated outcomes. So that's misuse, abuse, opioid use disorder, and death. I put a dotted line around non-medical use because they overlap a little bit the way they're defined, and just to make it clear for everybody. But the idea is that today what I'm talking to you about is non-medical use, not misuse, abuse. I talked a little bit about abuse, and it was very interesting to me that the abuse signal in NMERX is much less than the non-medical use signal. So I'm concerned that we're seeing a gradual increase in non-medical use that will eventually affect these other steps unless we're paying attention and doing something about it. There's a ton of questions. I won't go through all of these, but we still haven't answered a lot of these questions and I don't think any of these are new, but do we really think that the fentanyl is illicit, and what does that actually mean? We need follow-up of the diversion and misuse of methadone and buprenorphine, for example, to understand whether those are actually safe or not, because I could easily see it being relatively safe for buprenorphine, but got concerned for methadone because of their pharmacokinetics. There's endless questions: the role of age, the role of the drug source, the route of the non-medical use, because we're asking, that information is there in the survey. Some would have to be collected by going back out to respondents, which we can do, and find out things like, why did you start injecting? We did a study once to show that, asked respondents who said, I injected my drug, to say, well, why? How did that start? Who got you started? What caused you to make the shift from whatever you were doing, oral or inhalation, to injection? And which extended release formulations are rising the most? I think, transdermal fentanyl is considered an extended release formulation, and that's concerning, although a lot of that may be misidentification, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears to the stimulants. Don't worry, there's not as many slides here, but it tells sort of the same story. Here we have non-medical use. This is NMERX, and we have the number of adults on the left again, and the trends in the chart, and you can see that each of the lines is increasing, not dramatically, but just slowly, inexorably rising, to the point that over 6 years, they have gone up 50 to 100%. Again, same concern. This is non-medical use, it's not abuse. And so we can't be sure that that's the case. One thing that's a little reassuring is that when we look at the RADAR's Poison Center program, we see that prescription stimulant cases, there's a fair number of them per 100,000 population, but they don't seem to be changing much. A lot of ups and downs, but fairly stable. But remember, this only represents people who have decided to call a poison center. So this is somebody at the far end of the spectrum, usually, or sometimes it's a naive person who just doesn't know what to expect and calls, even though they're not terribly ill, but they're confused or concerned about some symptoms they have. So again, kind of a mixed bag on the data. We know that if we look at national data, like the mortality data, it's concerning, but I'm not sure how applicable, but we should note that if we look at cocaine and the psychostimulants, their mortality from both of them is increasing substantially. even as opioids are decreasing. And I'm sorry, that slide was both cocaine and psychostimulants. And the next slide is just the psychostimulants. The psychostimulants include methamphetamine, amphetamine, methylphenidate, and MDMA. So it's very hard to sort out what these, which one's which. Methamphetamine is probably the largest one there. A lot of MDMA is actually methamphetamine when you test it. So it's hard to know what this relationship between the prescription drug supply and the illicit drug use is, which is what we really need to understand to move forward. So very similar questions for the stimulants as for the opioids. We know there's this relationship between opioids and stimulants. Users like to combine them. That's the old speedball that we used to talk about in the 60s and 70s, for those of you who were alive then. And so it's a well-established fact, except we don't understand it very well, and we're not really investigating it much these days. But it seems to be getting more important, not less important. And as I mentioned, really all those questions I mentioned for opioids really apply to the stimulants as well. Now I'm going to switch to the psychedelics. So what I've just talked about is really going to be covered in much more detail by our speakers in the morning, and then we'll have a panel at the end of the morning. Please put questions in so that we can address those questions. The psychedelics are just so completely fascinating. I've listed them there. It's no reason to really read the list to you, but there's at least twice this many that are currently under development, have notified FDA that they are developing their drug for a therapeutic use. And that doesn't include the state programs or the illicit use that we see rising in essentially every state. There's a the applications are very wide for the psychedelic medications, and in many ways they're some of the most exciting therapeutic agents that have come up in my career. We're taking people like with PTSD and depression that is resistant to treatment, have failed repeatedly, and then a substantial portion of those people will respond to a psychedelic medication, psilocybin, MDMA, and the others. And so it's exciting in that way, and I can't wait for them for someone to pass the FDA bar and get approved and get on the market. But already the list is just expanding dramatically. Smoking cessation, the bottom one, romantic relationships. I said this last year, but it just stuns me. It's like, that means basically I don't know about you, but that means basically all of us. I've been married for 31 years, and romantic relationships still would be an issue, I think. So how do we address this incredibly widespread use of psychedelic medications? I would say that the idea is we want to identify what the safe use conditions for these drugs are. And that's challenging in the case of psychedelics. So here I listed a few of the types of psychedelic users. We have supervised versus unsupervised. That's referring to the state programs, where that's how those programs are structured. Is if you have to be supervised to take drug within the confines of the programs in Oregon and Colorado, at least. We have experienced people and unexperienced people, and especially those of us who were alive in the 60s. Set and setting it just rolls off your tongue, but it's really crucial to being able to understand and predict issues with the psychedelics, because the set and setting is critical. Each of these variables I'm showing here is basically a variation on set and setting. We have tested drug and untested drug. We know this is a huge issue with the opioids, and it will be with the psychedelics as well. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, MDMA, when you test it on the street, is often methamphetamine. So if you're not in a state program, that person is they don't even know the drug that they're using, actually, unless they have tested it themselves. There's constructive use and unconstructive use. And what I mean by that is more a person who has a constructive goal. I mean, they're trying to improve themselves, and there's a lot of people like that, versus someone who really, that isn't their issue at all. They're a polydrug user, and there's not a specific goal there for the use of the psychedelic. Spiritual and non-spiritual, obviously, is important. Unconstructive use is basically recreational use, and we see, I'll show you some data on that in a second, we see that pretty regularly. But probably the most challenging of all these is that each of these exists in combination. A person who's unexperienced will become experienced. Well, what effect does that have on the safety, the efficacy and the safety of the drug? There's lots of random testing essentially going on, uncontrolled experiments going on out there right now. And we see these in the emergency departments, and we see them in some other data sources. It's there if we look for it. But I think it's entirely possible that, I mean, people are going to do this, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do it necessarily, but we need to understand it so that when those people are using a psychedelic, they use it in a safe way. Because most of them want to use it in a safe way, but they don't always know what that is. So our team sat down and said, well, this is a couple years ago, but what's the environment? What's it going to be like when psychedelic products are approved at the state or federal level? So we do have 2 states who have programs in place, and then eventually I'm sure we'll have some federal FDA approvals. So our belief is, or our conclusions, these aren't beliefs actually, this is our rational thought conclusions, I guess, is that psychedelic therapeutic agents will be used appropriately. The psychedelics have a major advantage over the opioids in the sense that they're given intermittently, they're not given 4 times a day. The patient doesn't have to take a lot of drug home in order to dose themselves. And so you have a very controllable situation. And FDA, if you look at esketamine, FDA has very much capitalized on that to create a system where it would be very difficult for a patient or the provider really to divert and misuse a drug in any substantial amount. But what we will see is that, as we see with all medications, I have to say, in my career, there is no medication that after it was approved wasn't found, wasn't tested, wasn't experimented with in the world with other conditions. I take a couple of them myself. So that's going to happen. The other thing is that the clinical trials can never cover the spectrum of people and other drugs that will be encountered when a person is using even an FDA-approved drug, say 2 years from now. There's all kinds of therapeutic agents, there's all kinds of illicit drugs, there's over-the-counter drugs, all of which can have interactions, and we just don't know very much about that right now. We would also say that most patients will benefit. And in fact, I think it's pretty likely that unexpected benefits may emerge. This is really easy to say after the GLP drugs have come out, because as people use these in wider and wider groups, it's very common to find other conditions that the drug actually does work for. It may not be approved for it, but that's why most of the prescriptions, or a lot of the prescriptions that a physician writes, are actually technically off-label. So we're going to see that happen for sure, and we need to collect data on that to understand which are appropriate and which aren't. Misuse will occur. It happens with every drug, and there'll be off-label use. There'll be variation in the support measures that are available to patients. There will be competition. So we'll have pharmaceutical and state programs. We'll have the illicit drug sources. We'll have misidentification of these products. And so one thing to really be important, that will really be important, is to optimize the identification of the product by the people using the products. There will be adverse events, there always are. There'll be a lot of numerous minor events. There will be serious events, some have been reported, have been pretty high profile. We don't really understand the rates of those things though, and we need to do that. And finally, we have to understand that there will be stigma. There already is stigma, even in, like Colorado has approved them, psilocybin mushrooms. There is stigma both positive and negative. There's people who don't want to use it because they're afraid of it. They have a negative stigma. There's also people who use it uncaringly or unthoughtfully, I'll say, because they're sure that psychedelics are just totally safe. So why not do it? We've developed 2 tools to work on this. One is the National Survey Investigating Hallucinogenic Trends. This is a national survey. It's the largest ongoing survey of adult psychedelic users. You're going to hear a lot more about this in the presentation, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But I'm going to show you a little bit of teaser data that you'll see more depth of these data in this afternoon session. So In this survey, if you look at reasons for use, and this is grouping all psychedelics together, one important observation here is that fun and enjoyment is the most common endorsement that people make. That's why they say they used it. The one I'm most interested in personally is the purple or blue purple down there, third from the bottom, which is to treat a medical symptom, because this in a way kind of defines the potential market. It's probably an underestimate, but the potential market for prescription drugs when they come out. But you can see we could debate all these, especially certain ones of these would create a lot of interesting discussion, I'm sure, but maybe you can put that in the questions. We just published this paper recently on psychedelic tourism showing that people travel in the US. Surprise, surprise, same thing happened for cannabis, but there's also a lot of international travel. What effect does that have on safety and efficacy? One other program that we've developed is what we call the Sentinel Poison Center program. This is a pilot program. It runs at Rocky Mountain Poison and Drug Safety, covers 4 states, and what we do is we augment the collection of Poison Center data with additional information to understand each call. This has been fascinating. One thing that's been very noticeable is essentially the vast majority of calls that we receive anyways that involve a psychedelic are from polydrug users for recreational reasons. It's not people who are trying to pursue a treatment of their PTSD, technically illegal right now, but not in Colorado. It's not them, it's the people who are using it in an uncontrolled and unsupervised manner. So that's all the content. I just want to introduce briefly our speakers. We have great speakers again this year, and I'm always gratified each year that so many people are willing to speak at our conference. Matthew Ellis is from WashU. Hannah Burkett's one of our own here from Rocky Mountain, and we're going to have several talks from Rocky Mountain people. But this year we have a lot of short talks so that you get right to the point and get the data out so that you can interpret it yourself. We have Lindsay Allen. This will be absolutely fascinating. She's from Northwestern University and the Buehler Center for Health and Policy and Economics, excuse me. Todd Korthus, who has been instrumental in Oregon and their implementation. You're going to love that talk. Melissa Lavasani, who's going to talk about some federal perspectives. And then our own Andrew Monti, who will introduce the afternoon and has some data for himself. And then these 4 speakers will be producing kind of vignettes of data that I mentioned that are short and to the point. We're very interested to understand what you think about those presentations, and please put your comments again in the speakers. And that's the end of my presentation. And back to Kate.
Thank you, Dr. Dart.